I finished stitching the fronts of my jacket, the lapel, and all the way down the fronts. The next thing I did is I took this entire piece over to my iron, and I pressed everything flat. I pressed it the way I stitched it so that I'm setting all my stitches. Now we're going to trim our seam allowances, and it's a little tricky how we're going to do this. We want the seam allowance that's on the side of the fabric that we see to the outside to be longer than the seam allowances that are to the inside. So on the collar, we are going to trim the collar seam allowance. So this is the upper collar. I'm going to trim the upper collar seam allowance. This is hard to do when I'm doing it under a camera. I'm going to trim the upper collar seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. Because this is the upper collar and this is the side. We want the longer seam allowance next to the side that we're going to see. I'm just going to trim some of it to show you. And then the under collar, here's my under collar. I'm going to trim the under collar seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. So you can see here, get everything out of the way, flip this over so you can see it. My under collar seam allowance will be trimmed shorter than the upper collar. And again, you know how we do corners. We trim, but we also, I just want to make sure that everything is trimmed away as nicely as possible so that when we go to press it, it's nice and not bulky. And remember, we're going to trim the corner the way we always trim a corner, which we've trimmed across, and then we'll trim across again as we need to. Sometimes I get a little narrower. So that's what we're going to do with the under collar. You're going to, the under collar seam allowance will be 1/8 inch. The upper collar, the one without the seam, will be 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, I've trimmed the fronts of my jacket so that you can see. I found it easier to trim my shorter seam allowance first and then trim the longer one. So just to go over again, what side is shorter, what side is longer. So I'm on the jacket side of the jacket, and the seam allowance on the jacket side from the bottom of the lapel up is the shorter seam allowance on the jacket side and the longer seam allowance on the facing. Below the bottom of the roll line, the jacket side is the longer seam allowance and the facing side is the shorter seam allowance. And don't forget down here at the bottom that you want to notch. So how closely you trim is going to depend on your fabric. It is recommended that the shorter seam allowance is 1/8 inch, that the longer seam allowance is 1/4 inch. Mine are a little bit longer. Those, if your fabric is especially ravelly, you may need to leave a little extra, especially if it's thinner. You can also, down here at the bottom, if you don't want to notch, you can trim them both relatively closely using pinking shears. That's perfectly fine. So you're going to have to try a little bit and try turning your jacket right side out just to double check that your trimming is working. Now, the recommendation for you as you go to press this is to actually press this seam open first before you turn the jacket. What's really handy is if you have a point presser to do that in. That's that long wooden piece with a point on the end that you can lay this up on top of and actually press that open. You could use a seam roll underneath this so that you're just pressing this. It will make your jacket press nicer when we turn it right side out, to make sure if you're able to press your seams open first. That's just, it always presses nicer if you can do that. So that's the next thing you're going to do. After you've stitched everything, you've trimmed everything. My scissors could obviously use a little sharpening. This is not the prettiest cuts I've ever seen. But give it a trim, press it, and then you're going to turn it to the right side. And there'll be some tips that I'm going to give you about that once you are turned and pressed and rolled to the right side.